Happy Canada Day, one and all. I'm going to argue for Canadian legitimacy, today, yesterday, and well into the century. Irvin Studin, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher of Global Brief magazine, President of the Institute for 21st Century Questions. Needless to say, as with much of the world, the last year and a half for Canada has been very, very difficult. The present remains difficult, the near-term future complex and difficult indeed. Where are we in Canada now? Well, we're in the throes of 6 national crises of system, perhaps 7. The pandemic and the general public health crisis, of which the pandemic is by now the minor part. The economic crisis, a catastrophic crisis in education, an institutional crisis, a national unity crisis, a crisis of terrible international weakness in the context of a destabilized world, and finally the chapeau, the 7th crisis, if you will, a social crisis. A need to renegotiate the norms of coexistence amongst ourselves, Canadians, across the 2nd largest geography in the world post-pandemic. Now, many countries have done much better than Canada. Indeed, I would argue, to my great chagrin and disappointment, occasional embarrassment, Canada has underperformed catastrophically in the context of the pandemic and the various crises at our feet. Institutional underperformance, political underperformance, policy underperformance, public administration underperformance, mentality underperformance. The pandemic threw us down several notches. Here's where we were post-pandemic. It took us down to this level. To get back, we needed a burst of energy across the systems that I mentioned. We still need it. We are somewhere here. The countries that were thrown down several pegs, but that were able to stay up here or come back here were, on the front end, those countries that managed to muster the energy across the systems again at the start of the pandemic: Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, Singapore, Vietnam, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand. They are up here. We are down here. The countries that later on in the pandemic, even through internal chaos at the start, were able to muster energy, largely through vaccination, but also through the will to survive, the will to succeed, political leadership, rhetoric, attitude of can-do. Israel, the United States, and belatedly the United Kingdom. All up here. We remain here. How do we get up here? Well, we're going to need the energy. What we must avoid, and this is where crises of legitimacy come to the fore, crises that we're experiencing now, self-doubt about Canada because of institutional underperformance, quality of life diminution. We must avoid self-justifying narratives at this level of performance. We have not yet been able to mobilize up here, especially in the leading provinces, Ontario to begin with, catastrophically, Quebec to some extent, Alberta to some extent, Saskatchewan, Manitoba to some extent. We need to muster the energy. If we end up self-justifying this level of performance, that is crumbling education, crumbling business, borders across the geography of the country, zombie theater in the population, social distancing ad infinitum with no intent to get out, indeed vaccinating as an end in itself, rather than, as with the Israelis, the Americans, and the Brits, and several other societies, vaccinating to get out, so that we forget about vaccination, which is the point of vaccination, we risk staying at a much lower equilibrium, which risks the entire project in terms of legitimacy. I'll return to that. Now, vaccination must be quick. We must also, to muster the energy, do 2 things. We must change our vocabulary. The vocabulary must be more purposeful over the next month and certainly into the fall. Firm timelines, firm intent, firm ambition, firm direction. And no turning back, no conditionalizing, no sentimentalizing. We are pivoting out. We are not vaccinating for form, we're not vaccinating for Facebook, we're not vaccinating to arbitrage between Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, or indeed Sputnik. There should be no time for that. We should be out. That's what a serious country does, indeed, because our future expectation of performance is this high, because the post-pandemic world is that much more difficult. Now, equilibrium amongst the legitimacies of Canada has an internal part and an external part. This is Canada. They must be in balance. If the internal legitimacy of Canada suffers, we crumble, as do many countries over the course of historical and strategic space-time. Or if the external equilibrium crumbles, if we get invaded, if we have a war, if we collapse through external catastrophe, again, Canada disappears. So over the course of constitutional strategic space-time, we are constituted in 1867 with difficulty, a legitimacy based on a pas à deux, the French and the English. The English win the 7 Years' War. They resuscitate the French so that they stay loyal in the context of American Revolution and American gravity after the Civil War into co-equals in Confederation. The French and the English in Canada, by and large, walk as co-equals. The Indigenous element was ostracized, marginalized, oppressed, tricked. The residential schools is just one symptom of that larger ouster from the confederal condition, the compact. But of course, now we understand in the year 2021 that that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable in terms of quality of life, not sustainable morally. So our job, as I've mentioned before, is to create a pas à trois entre français, anglais et autochtone, dans la mesure du possible. It's going to be very, very difficult, and we may not make that pas à trois, but try we must. But it gets more difficult still because within this, we not only have the Indigenous question, we have the Western question, which is coming home to roost. We have the Quebec question, which is alive and well and could still tear the country asunder. And we have many borders across the geography of our internal market. We have borders that close the Maritimes off, the northern part off, different provinces from one another. We need to disabuse ourselves of those borders and resolder the Confederation in the context of an intent to renew the legitimacy domestically. But it gets more complicated still because our borders this century are much more wicked, as we've discussed many times over. America is here, China's here, Russia's here, Europe is there. All great powers, all essentially nuclear, all close to us. Within this configuration of great powers, there are 15 combinations of external pulls and pressures that could crush us on any given day. So we could fall apart domestically, we could fall apart externally. But it gets exciting because Canada is an interesting country. We've lived 154 years. The average lifespan of a country is about 60 years, I've calculated. So we're well past our past due date, which means there's something good about it. We live well, or we have lived well to date, with all of the failings, imperfections, and pathologies of a society that lives well. How to live well and reconsolidate or reconstitute that legitimacy well into this century. For the next 79, 80 years to the year 2100, well, work, work, work. Energy, as I mentioned, across the systems in crisis. Not a zombie ideology or a sentimental lower-level equilibrium. That will be the death of us. It may be good for Facebook and it may be good for a family conversation for the moment. But for the long run, we must elevate the energy here. Vocabulary purposive. Reconstituting the rhythm of life. By fall, without excuses, no zombie schools. Real schools, day to day. Hockey is back, soccer is back, the cafes are back, business is back. We are reconstituting the rhythm of Canadian life with all the renewed complexity post-pandemic. If we make it to this point, the year 2100, it will be a huge achievement because let us not forget, and let me close on this bright note, Canada would take a millennium to build if it ever did fall apart. Other countries would think us extremely foolish to let such a huge construction fall apart, a construction that is still the envy of the world, where most people have lived very well, where there are huge imperfections, but where the future is extremely bright. If we survive this configuration, we will be one of the major countries of the 21st century. If we could survive the internal configuration, we'll be one of the most interesting countries in history. But to do so, we need to fight and dream all the way to the future, walk it back and say, what is the plan? What is our thinking? What type of mentality needs to be constructed? Canada, let me surprise you, is as big as the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire all combined. And we live peaceably, we live with a high reputation, we live, as I mentioned again, imperfectly. Let us perfect a highly imperfect project, aim to survive and succeed. I'm for that vision. Happy Canada Day again.